Let's move on to main topic number 3. And our third main topic today gets submitted to us by Geeky Gator, who writes, "Hey, John and crew. So I recently read on the New York Times that Warner Brothers wanted to further postpone Tenet, because you guys remember, Tenet was just postponed by 2 whole weeks from July 17th to July 31st. I just read in the New York Times that Warner Brothers wanted to further postpone Tenet as they were concerned about their investment, but kept it into July to please Christopher Nolan. A few weeks ago, it was also revealed that Nolan is going to get 20% of the film's first dollar gross, which is insane. Nolan seems to have Warner Brothers on a leash. Should a director be able to control a big film studio this much?" All right, thanks for sending that in, man. And yeah, that's a big question right here. So let's give a little bit of background to this. Christopher Nolan was very, very vocal on the fact that he wanted his movie Tenet to be one of the if not the first and the first big new release movie out there to get people back into the movie theaters. Christopher Nolan is a hardcore believer in the movie theater experience. That's the only way he thinks people should see movies. That's the way he thinks the best movie viewing experiences are. And he believes in the movie theater going experience extremely. So he wanted that release date of July 17th. Now, it was clear, or at least it became clear, that the movie theaters were not going to be open in time to have a bit of a buildup before July 17th. Like, they were going to be open by July 17th, but they needed to be open before July 17th and before it enough to have a couple of weeks to get the word out that the theaters are open again, to get the word out that the movies are here, to build some word of mouth, get people back into the habit of coming back to the movie theaters. And so they delayed it to the 31st to give the movie theaters a few more weeks. Well, apparently now, the story that's going around, this came to us from the New York Times, is that Christopher Nolan made Warner Brothers keep that date in July. That Warner Brothers actually wanted to move it to near the end of the year, maybe even into 2021, but Christopher Nolan insisted he wanted it kept in July. He wanted it kept in July almost right away. And now understand, Christopher Nolan is the film's director. He's not the distributor. He should have no say in that sort of thing. But they wanted to please him. This is what comes to us out of the New York Times. They wrote this. "In recent weeks, Warner, concerned about its Tenet investment," because remember, it's their money. It's their money that's being spent here. "Concerned about its Tenet investment, was leaning in favor of postponement. While Mr. Nolan, a fervent advocate for preserving the movie-going experience, was more eager to press ahead. The discussions amounted to a fraught moment for Warner. Mr. Nolan is a proven moneymaker, and the studio wants to keep him happy," which, of course, is no kidding. Of course, you want to keep Christopher Nolan happy. So this brings up a question that Geeky Gator was asking in his main question. Should a director have that kind of power over a studio? Now, remember, a director's job is to make a movie. That's what they're gifted in. That's what they're skilled in. They're skilled in telling stories. They're not business executives. They're not distributors. And I would say under most circumstances, a director should have no say in when a movie is released. That's not your area of expertise. If you don't want some movie executive to bud their nose into your area of expertise, then you keep your nose out of their area of expertise. You just make your movie, make it the best way you can, and then you leave the distribution and all that kind of stuff up to the people who know that better than you do, because it's their money and it's their movie. So most of the time, I would say no. No director should have that kind of power over a studio, especially considering I have no idea how Warner Brothers agreed to give Christopher Nolan, who is one of the best directors in the world, 20% of the box office. Do you know what that means? If Tenet were to make $1 billion, and I'm not saying it's going to make $1 billion, but if Tenet makes $1 billion, Christopher Nolan's going to get a $200 million paycheck. $200 million. Warner Brothers is already going to be scrapping to make money on this movie. And that ain't going to help. So on top of the fact that he's getting 20% of the box office, he's now telling them when to release the movie. Under normal circumstances, I would say no, that should not be the case. However, there are exceptions, in my opinion, to every rule. There are exceptions to every rule. There are rules, and those rules should be followed. But even the most hardcore of rules, there are exceptions here and there. And I would suggest that keeping Christopher Nolan happy at Warner Brothers has to be a high priority for Warner Brothers. Listen, there's a couple things you need to understand about Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers is one of the last remaining studios that truly values its place in the art. They love the movie business. They really do. I've talked to a lot of people at Warner Brothers. They love the movie business and they love the filmmaking art. And it's even bit them in the ass sometimes that they give filmmakers a little bit too much leeway and it doesn't always work out. But they really believe they understand their place in Hollywood history and all that kind of stuff. When you understand that Christopher Nolan is one of the absolute best filmmakers in the world right now, some would argue he might be the best filmmaker. We're doing it right now. And how much Warner Brothers values working with him because his movies don't just make them money. Christopher Nolan's movies gives them prestige. Not to be confused with his movie, The Prestige. His movies bring the studio prestige. His movies bring the studio honor. And his movies bring the studio money. All the things that Warner Brothers values highly. The prestige, the money, the honor, and the panache of saying we're the studio that they would say the best filmmaker in the world today works with us, Warner Brothers. When you're in a situation like that, I think you get into the territory of the exception to the rule. Listen, I just said I don't think filmmakers should have that much power over the business side of things. I don't think they should be given that much leeway. They should stick to what it is that they do and do well and just focus on that, let business, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But I think when it comes to Christopher Nolan, it's a little bit different. Let's do what I often do, which is throw out a little bit of a sports analogy. A player on an NBA team should not have control over or say over what the general manager does. Who the general manager trades for and all that kind of stuff. Generally, that shouldn't be the case. But listen, if you're a team that has LeBron James, you make an exception. When LeBron James says, I want this guy traded, you trade him. When LeBron James says, we need to acquire this position and this position, you go out and get him. There's a reason why LeBron James took 3 different teams to 7 straight NBA finals. And so when he talks, you kind of listen. And there have been other athletes that are on that level as well, but they're a very, very small, select group of players that you can put into that category. Just like I would say, I think there's a very, very small, select group of filmmakers that you can give that kind of leeway to. I would argue right now, there's only 3 directors in all of Hollywood who get that kind of leeway. Christopher Nolan, Steven Spielberg, and Quentin Tarantino. I think, and Quentin Tarantino, I mean, I think you do that for the honor, the panache. We do Tarantino films, but they don't make the same money that Christopher Nolan films do. So I only think there's 3 directors in all of Hollywood who make that exception. And I think if you're Warner Brothers and these are your values, the prestige, the honor, the money, and all studios is money, but this is a filmmaker that brings them all. Maybe you say to yourself, you know what? We're willing. Let's say this turns out to be disastrous. Let's say we end up losing money on Tenet because of when we're releasing it and how much we're paying Chris. That might be worth it for the next 3 or 4 films you're going to make with Chris. Right? Okay, we take a loss right now. But it makes sure that Christopher Nolan knows that we value him. It keeps Christopher Nolan wanting to still work with us. And so we'll make 3 or 4 movies with him and we'll more than cover whatever losses we have with Tenet. Again, I don't think that sort of leeway should be given to almost any filmmakers, but I think when you're Warner Brothers and you're talking about Christopher Nolan, I think that's the exception. And yeah, if Christopher Nolan says, I want to keep this movie in July, it's important to me. I think it's important to the film industry. I think it's important to the theater industry. It means very, very much to me, Warner Brothers, to keep this movie here. If you're Warner Brothers, you go, well, this is stupid, but let's keep them happy because we might lose money right now, but we're going to continue to make money with this guy moving forward. So let's say, okay, Chris, whatever you want. I don't like it in general, but I think there are exceptions. I think Christopher Nolan is that exception. So listen, guys, I wanted to know what you guys thought about that. So I decided to make that the topic of today's question of the day. And the question of the day, simply, I put this up just before the show started, and I asked you guys a simple question. The major trades report that Warner Brothers wanted to move Tenet further out, but kept it in July because director Christopher Nolan insisted. Considering Nolan is also getting paid 20% of Tenet's box office, should a director like Christopher Nolan have that much control? Let me just expand this a bit. Have that much power over a studio? We discussed this and more. A little over 3,300 of you guys have already voted on this poll, and 69% of you seem to be in agreement with me here. Yes, he's Christopher Nolan. Maybe not other directors, but Christopher Nolan, whereas a full 31% of you saying like, no, man, no director should have that much power and control over what a studio does. If you guys, by the way, want to participate in this poll, it is in the community tab of the John Campea YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so you guys can also participate in our daily question of the day polls there. So that's where we're at right now. 69% of you saying yup. 31% of you are saying no. Question is, guys, what do you guys watching right now think about that? Jump down into the comment section below and leave me your thoughts. All right, guys.